Welcome back to Shat on TV Watchmen, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Watchmen. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, Roger Roper.
For while I may be your master, I am most definitely not your maker.
And this is our deep dive episode where we look back at this week's episode of Watchmen and provide our thoughts and analysis. This week's episode was titled, If You Don't Like My Story, Write Your Own. Raj, what did you think?
Well, I actually missed this episode, the initial airing, due to a U.S. women's national match. I'm actually here in Florida. I'm extending my time here. I was with Big D. We did an episode of Shat the Movies, and then I drove up to Jacksonville, watched the women's game. I'm going to stay in town, go to the men's game on Friday because I like pain. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to watch this as most people were when it launched at the regular airing time. And unfortunately, on the drive home, I saw some early reaction to this episode on Twitter, and people were saying it was the weakest so far, and it was a so-called filler episode. And I really wanted to make sure I watched it before I went to sleep at night, at least get the initial viewing. So I watched it around like 12:30 at night, and my initial reactions were similar to some of the reactions on Twitter and on social media. Upon second viewing this morning, however, when I was sober and not in a haze of active patriotic feelings towards the world champion women's team, I think this episode is as good as the others we've seen so far. It may not be the best if we're stack ranking, but there were a lot of questions that were answered. A lot of our suspicions have come true, which makes me feel good about myself in terms of the clues that we've been picking up for, and a lot of the clues that the audience has been writing in at shatontv.com. I still think it's quality entertainment, and there's definitely some new mysteries. So this show continues to progress without getting mired or lost in too many theories or getting too full of itself. So I really liked it.
A little behind the scenes for everyone listening at home or in your cars. Raj and I are both traveling right now. He's in Florida. I'm in Louisville. And after we watch the episode, that's when the work begins. So we've taken our notes. We start putting those notes in and comparing notes so we can kind of tell what we're going to talk about and settle on some buckets that we're going to discuss for the episode. And as we're doing that, our notes for the first time, I think, in this series are like almost identical. Like we want to talk about the same stuff. And I had the same feelings as you, Raj. My judgment of this episode is roughly the same as yours. Several of my friends and many TV blogs call this episode filler, which is a term I detest, especially in a series that's this dense and this emotionally moving. Filler is what you call like an episode on season 7 of The Walking Dead that doesn't move the plot forward at all, doesn't reveal anything about the characters. And Damon Lindelof, who is deeply passionate about this project, I just listened over the weekend to his official Watchmen podcast, and he cares a lot about this. He is not wasting a single one of these 9 episodes on filler. And yes, perhaps episode 4 wasn't as powerful as episode 3, but to me, it might have given us the best taste of our favorite characters' personalities. We saw a lot behind the mask, both figuratively and literally, and it gave us some reasonable explanations for all of the bizarre shit that's been happening.
Yeah, and I like that. And I wonder if Lindelof works best in a contained bubble or a biodome, if you will, right? When he's not working on network television and they're just like, we're going to milk this for as long as it can because it's wildly popular and we need to make ad revenue. Like there has not been any announcements that there will be a second season of Watchmen. And if it were to end, hopefully this story is so self-contained enough that all these answers or all the things that we've seen so far are going to be answered. And so far he's not disappointing with that. So my hat's off to Mr. Lindelof so far.
Yeah, and to prove that this is not a filler episode, we're going to cram in as much as we can in the next hour. So we're going to start off by talking about these 2 topics that Lindelof signaled in the official podcast were the themes, the overriding motif for this series, The Watchmen. One is legacy. So legacy in the sense of things being passed down within a family, legacy in the sense of people being inspired by other, legacy in the sense of trauma. It's all carried out in this series. And the other idea is reckoning. Now, Lindelof says specifically it's reckoning with regards to race. So just a settling of accounts. And we saw a lot of that. So we're going to talk about that primarily in this episode. Also, we're going to talk about making babies, which we saw a lot of in this episode. It ranged from adorable to really fucking weird. And kind of took the show to another level of bizarre. We're going to talk about Ozymandias and his attempts to escape, which are both comical and very interesting. And we're also going to talk about trust and recklessness between characters. Just are people beginning to bond more closely together, or are people sick of the masks and just getting a bit careless? Finally, Raj, we're going to talk about lots of odds and ends that didn't really fit into any specific bucket, but are very interesting to talk about. And this episode was littered with them. Several blogs have now become dedicated to just counting the Easter eggs in these episodes, and there are tons. And later in the week, we'll get to some of the letters, which are fantastic. A few of them will get folded into this episode, but there were fantastic ones. Again, if you'd like to write into us, host at shatontv.com. We'll try to get to those on our newsstand episode. But Raj, starting off the entire podcast, I want to talk about this idea of legacy and reckoning. And to cue it up, a letter from longtime listener Ash Schlafly. Ash writes in, the title this week, If You Don't Like My Story, Write Your Own, comes from the novel Angela's husband is reading, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. If you've not read the book, basically it's a story of an African man that is coming to grips with European corporate exploration, exploitation, and expansion through the African jungle. It describes what happens when a culture is overrun and replaced by a more dominant culture that has come in to take over. A perfect theme for the Thanksgiving season, no? What's more important about the novel, though, is Achebe's reason for writing it. He believed that it was a great travesty that so many of the well-known stories about Africa and the African experience were not written by African people. He thus wanted to tell his own story.
Yeah, and I really like this because Cal, when Angela returns back to the house and she's like, I'm really trying to start a fight, he's sitting there, he's reading this book. Again, that's where the title comes in, as Ash mentioned. But the title, the titular character, Oquando, at the end of the book, she mentions, he hangs himself, right? And I wonder if there's a parallel between the meaning of the title and the fact that it comes from this book and the fact that episode 1 launched with one of our main characters hanging himself and setting forth in motion the series of events that are kind of unfolding here. So I wonder if there's a little bit of backstory and that could be Judd's reasoning for sacrificing himself, if you believe that he sacrificed himself for a greater good, or it could be the reason that someone else may have killed him and then hung him up.
Now, listening to the official Watchmen podcast, Lindelof seems almost scarred by the experience of Lost, where he's like, I'm not going to leave a bunch of open-ended questions. I'm going to give you answers. And I think in this series, he definitely made a series that he himself would watch. He said that was a priority, but also doesn't want it to be too cerebral so that the mysteries are unsolvable by a reasonably intelligent person. And so he's giving us like literal cues in this episode. He has Lady Trieu specifically mentioned legacy as a word in the script. We also see Looking Glass literally say it's a reckoning. So he's making no bones about what this episode is about. And things are often visual. When we talk about a legacy like a family tree, Angela goes to the cultural center and learns about her possible great-grandparents. And the show goes so far as to like put up a diagram for us. Hey, viewer, this is where she comes from. This is legacy. And she sees her great-grandparents, Obie and Ruth Robeson.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess they didn't think that there were going to be all these independent podcasts coming out and trying to and being companion piece for the podcast, right? They're going to hit our head over. They're going to hit it over our head, and I wonder if that's why people who are so fascinated with the show and following along with us on social media and Twitter thought that this was a filler episode, because I think we kind of already connected the dots of the family tree. It was a little sentimental for me when she got down on one knee and kind of looked at young Will's face and put her face in there. It was a little bit, come on. But I get it. The one thing that was fascinating, I'm not sure if you thought the same thing that I did, but as she gets her little acorn, her little token into the museum and puts it into the ancestry, you see that there's a sign, but it says it's powered by the Legend Fund, and who could be funding that, especially when you think of Lady Trieu and all of her connections with biopharmaceutical companies that she owns and the DNA. I wonder if there's some sort of connection there that they're telling us through these visual cues.
All of us moving into this digital world, were fascinated by all these free services. I'm like, Google just gives you email for free?
Yeah.
Like Facebook, you just use it for free? Google, you can search for stuff for free? How will they ever make money? How do you think Netflix only costs, $14 a month? There's data collection. And so clearly there would be the Legend Fund going behind the ancestry would be a great way to collect information on people and know who can make children, who can't make children, where people come from, who has legacy. And there does seem to be a connection there. Now, legacy also appears in a much more literal sense, where people are living almost mirrors of the past. And Lady Trieu's daughter, who we realize she's the girl who is collecting magazines and newspapers from the newsstand. We see her much more in this episode, kind of as a greeter at the Millennium Tower. And in one scene, she wakes up, she's having a nightmare, and she pulls an IV out of her arm, and she goes to her mother and she says, I was having this nightmare about men coming to burn my village and being forced to walk very far. And she says, my feet hurt, like in real life, my feet hurt. And Lady Trieu says, good. So I started thinking about it. And the first thing that came to mind, obviously, as they come from Vietnam, was the My Lai massacre, where U.S. soldiers committed one of the worst wartime atrocities of all time, going into a village in search of Viet Cong, opening fire on women and children, raping, pillaging, and burning the village. It was actually only stopped by a U.S. Helicopter pilot landing between the villagers and the soldiers and threatening to open fire. And that's actually how it was stopped. And eventually some people were brought to justice, but it scarred the Vietnamese people and really put kind of the nail in the coffin on the war as far as atrocities go. We see here that memory seems to be carried on through this nightmare in Bian, which makes us wonder how closely she is related to Lady Trieu. Is she just a daughter or something more?
Yeah, there's definitely this overarching theme that we'll get to the lake of babies here when we talk about Ozzy. But whether you want to call them clones, whether you want to call them genetically modified humans, GMHs, I got that same sense from Bian. And we talked about Lady Trieu and how Lady Trieu, she was a 3rd century revolutionary, right?
Yeah, she basically repelled Chinese invaders from Vietnam. Ultimately, I mean, they made it through, but Vietnam has a long history of repelling invaders in one way or another. They will never be fully occupied.
If we were to put on our tinfoil hats, and these are just completely Raj's rantings and musings, but if I had to connect the reason why they would name a character Lady Trieu after a 3rd century revolutionary that repelled Chinese invaders, and knowing the events that transpired in the Watchmen universe in Vietnam, where Dr. Manhattan worked on behalf of the U.S. government and was killing indiscriminately all these villagers. And you have to imagine that they're also infusing historical events like the My Lai massacre. Lady Trieu's intention for taking over Arthur Veidt's companies, and maybe her whole motivation is based on retribution and getting back at the country that massacred her family, her legacy, especially as we're talking about this idea of legacy, and perhaps her mom was involved in that. And again, very tinfoily here, but is Bian, who we don't know if she has a father, and in Vietnamese, Bian means secretive. Perhaps she is a clone of her own mother, because also in the Watchtower, she's imported a lot of native plants and greenery. She has to keep the humidity up because those native plants require that environment. So she's almost like you said, there's a connection there with Vietnam. Legacy
again appearing in the form of this promise that Lady Trieu made to her mother never to leave Vietnam. So she kind of brought the Vietnam with her. And that legacy, Lady Trieu then takes it on the roadshow when she approaches the Clarks. Now, again, this looks like it's probably a flashback scene. She goes to the Clarks, who have the roadside egg farm. They are not able to reproduce. They've had issues with fertility. And she basically goes there and says, listen, made you a baby, by the way, and I'll trade it to you for your 40 acres of land that are surrounding the farm. Now, the 40 acres is a pretty obvious reference to 40 acres and a mule. This was the promise that was made to former slaves, that you would be given 40 acres to settle on and a mule to farm that land. But for people who are not big DC Comics fans or have been living in a cave, there's a lot of references to Superman here. We see Lady Trieu deliver the Clarks this special baby on the same night as something rockets and crashes into Earth. There's a farm, Clark Kent. So, there were it's very evocative of Superman here. And what was interesting about it in particular, though, was the timing, right? So she had to incubate this baby, deliver it exactly on the night within 3 minutes of this thing crashing to Earth. So Lady Trieu seems to know what's going to happen a bit in advance, whether it's a combination of the data she has or some other ability.
Yeah, and the reason we suppose this is a flashback is all the hints that we're being told, right? When she introduces herself, the Clarks seem to know who she is. This happens to take, if you were to follow the Wikipedia, this is probably in the late 2000s or early 2010s, right as she overtook Veidt's holdings and carried forth in the completion and the building of the Millennium Clock Tower. The Clarks say, well, you're the lady that's building that tower just down the road. And then as they fly over that crash landing spot, the landscape and the topography changes from farmland to this new Tulsa downtown where Sister Night has her Saigon bakery. And also it seems that's the exact landing of that asteroid or whatever is falling from the sky is right where the photo booth is, or not the photo booth, the phone booth where Laurie in the previous episode was dialing up Manhattan. So there's got to be some sort of reason. There has to be some sort of pinpoint. And she had to know all of the timing, like you said, and where this was going to land. I think the big question on everyone's mind is, what is that? What was that asteroid? It doesn't look to be Dr. Manhattan. Dr. Manhattan doesn't fall from the sky, right? It's not a car that's falling from the sky. Could it possibly be another character on the show that we've already seen? And my guess would be as good as yours at this point.
We're led to believe because of the Superman tale that some sort of a being landed, but it could be an energy source. It could be all sorts of things. When we entered this podcast, I was like, Raj, I got it. It's Adrian Veidt. He's returning to Earth.
It is shaped in the form of an egg. And one of the things that I immediately got messages from was all these allusions to eggs. We've seen eggs almost in every episode. And in this episode, it's all over the place because they were making babies.
And this doesn't just start with the current Watchmen. If you go all the way back to the graphic novel, Adrian Veidt was fucking with genetically modified beings as early as 1985, making his his pet cat that was all sorts of fucking weird. And he also had his like 3 henchmen or whatever who were genetically modified as well. Now we see that, as you mentioned, Lady Trieu has a daughter. There's no father in the picture. And conspicuously, Petey wasn't invited to meet with everybody else, which is a great scene. Petey scenes are like becoming my favorite thing about the show. But he's just kind of left to just kind of like, twiddle his thumbs out there in the main room of the Millennium Tower. But, you factor in the IV in Bian's arm. She's not, clearly she's getting some sort of a medical treatment. And we might have Trieu kind of following in Veidt's footsteps, not just in the holdings of the company, but with this creation of genetically altered beings.
Yeah, Veidt not only looked at eggs as a symbolism for his genetically modified beings, but he also, I think, looked at humanity as eggs, right? There's a famous line in the graphic novel, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And you've seen, again, in a previous episode, you've seen Angela cracking the eggs that, form in the Watchmen face. At the farm, the Mrs. Clark is out on the side selling her eggs. And then she kind of trips up the stairs and breaks her eggs. And I think that was kind of symbolism or an allusion to the fact she can't give birth. But the craziest moment of the episode, and that the one that everyone's talking, is this kind of reverse matrix, this lobster trap of babies and in this world or prison, biodome maybe that Ozzy is living in. I got a kick out of that. How he's just kind of rowing out there to the lake, and he's got his little lamps where he's set all of his traps, and he's just pulling up these little babies.
It's 2019, and it's hard to find TV at this point that makes you look twice or kind of get shivers or shake your head. And I'm watching the episode with a couple of my friends here in Louisville, and he's pulling up the traps, and I'm like, oh, yeah, he's pulling up traps full of babies, joking, thinking that I missaw something on the screen. No, there's little fucking babies that he's pulling out of crab traps. And then it gets weirder as he incubates them in some sort of like a torture centrifuge. And there have been a couple people who have said, I think Ash Lafley is one of them, and other people online who have been like, hey, maybe there's a time lapse here, that this process doesn't just spin a baby around really quickly and make an adult. And I was inclined to agree with that, because I always like to go with the reasonable explanation. But I saw a couple indicators that it actually is some sort of a speed centrifuge that spawns adults. One thing is you know that Ozymandias just massacred a bunch of people in the dining hall. During that entire sequence where he pulls the babies up, puts them in the centrifuge, he's hanging out, listening to some Rocksteady, and he's got blood on his arm still, and that blood does not, go away. Also, Ozymandias doesn't seem to be aging significantly as these guys are being matured, so it's not like they take years or even months. I think this is a fairly quick process. Now, it might be a time lapse of a couple hours, but I think he's able to turn these guys around pretty quickly.
The steampunk centrifuge also kind of looked like an egg itself. It was egg shaped. So again, another reference to eggs. Now, I got the sense that Ozzy didn't really like this process. It appears as if he's done this multiple times, right? He has that kind of cold, deliberate view that I have on my face every time I'm doing laundry, right? He's just going up. This is more of a chore for him, but he still feels, again, Ozymandias as a character sometimes is described as cold and calculated, but really he does care about, ultimately he cares about humanity. That like his whole goal was to save it when he dropped the psychic squid. And again, Jeremy Irons is such a fantastic actor. That moment where he puts the babies in the centrifuge and they start going, you hear kind of the faints and the sounds of the babies crying. And it's pretty powerful. I got pretty emotional and choked up, and I started thinking to myself, could I handle that? And he goes immediately to the record player. He throws on old school reggae. He starts eating the cake that he already hates, right? And I wonder if that was designed to get his mind off of this process, and show a little bit of the fact that he is still this superhero in his mind, where he's doing this for the fate of humanity, and he's not just a selfish asshole.
Yeah, there's a dichotomy there where, he seems to relish the violence, yet at the same time, when he's plucking these babies from the traps and seeing the ones that are unfit, whether they're the wrong sex or not hardy enough or whatever, and he has to they cough up a little water and he just chucks them back into the water. Right. I mean, it seems pretty cold, but then you see that, he does have to have some coping mechanisms here. And I started to kind of postulate theories as like, how does this thing work? Right now, we know that he says that while I may be your master, I'm most definitely not your maker. I think that there's a flaw here. He now, whether it was Dr. Manhattan or Lady Trieu who created this sort of Eden for Ozymandias, and there's definitely is that Adam and Eve sort of things with Crookshanks and Phillips. I think Ozymandias maybe at some point wanted to be away from the world, kind of like how Manhattan did. And maybe this Eden has to have some sort of a life source that life forms come out of to keep regenerating this environment. And so perhaps this lake serves as like a giant petri dish, right? And Ozymandias simply learned how to hack the waters to mature his own servants. And perhaps he's like seeding these traps, right? Kind of like you do with a crab trap or a lobster trap. You got to put some sort of bait in there, but he's maybe seeding it and then, chucking in the ones that don't work for him. But he still has to go through this horrible process of egg-shaped steampunk incubator cyclone. And then, you understand what I'm saying to you, but you can't respond. Right. I got to train you all over again. It's a pretty horrible cycle.
He thought that these beings were almost an abomination, and what the makers designed for these were not what he would want, because he doesn't believe that life is just being grown in a petri dish or an egg centrifuge. You have to have purpose to have life. That's what truly gives you and makes you human.
Yeah, he calls them flaws in the fortress design.
That's right.
His existence in this sort of paradise lacks purpose, and now he needs one, right? So he's kind of saying the same thing, like you could just live here, but what the fuck's the point? And so his purpose has now become escape. It's almost like he has to do something just to keep himself occupied.
There is a mystery of what happened to Ozzy, and the last known public appearance, I believe he was visiting Vietnam or victims of the Vietnamese massacre. And then there's a conspiracy theory that's going on of why Ozzy disappeared. Maybe it was due to Vietnamese revolutionaries. And if you're getting into some Charlie Day meme territory, if you're trying to connect all these dots, perhaps there is some truth to that conspiracy theory, because I think there's always a little bit of truth in conspiracy theories, and connecting those Vietnamese revolutionaries to Lady Trieu and how he disappeared, because no one's seen him since that time. So Very interesting.
Yeah, and so it begs the question, if Ozymandias is trying to escape, where is he? Listener Stephen Whitcomb wrote in, and he's like, is Ozymandias on the moon? Because we see that he's looking through the telescope, which there were a couple of really cool visual shots. You mentioned one, which was the overlay of a young Will Reeves face over Angela's, which might either be melodramatic if you're one type of viewer, or really cool if you're another. We also see this Ozzy kind of watching these moonshots through the telescope, and then you see the moon in the sky. So listener Stephen Whitcomb wrote in, he said, is he on the moon? I think it's a little too on the nose. I really like the visual effect, but it seems a little too simple.
Yeah, I think it's a little too soon. I think it's supposed to invoke that he's from outer space. And if you're connecting the dots here, the fact that he's trying to create a spacesuit of some sort of way to live outside of the elements of, if he is trapped in a biodome, and we think he's trapped in a biodome because as he's launching the dead bodies, which is, I guess, why he killed all those. He I guess doesn't want to put live people on there. I don't know. Maybe that's some sort of, again, pointing to Ozymandias's sense of mercy. He will kill him first, then he'll put them on the trebuchet and toss them out. I think he's trying to see how far he needs to launch, or what the angle of the trebuchet is, in order to get out of this, because they seem to just disappear into the sky, and the sky seems to be this fake Truman Show almost set piece.
And it's funny, Rod, you say like, oh, it's some sort of mercy, but we're guilty of that ourselves as humans. They're like, hey, do you want to dissect a live pig? No. What if I kill it first? Okay. Right. Sounds good. But what's interesting about this feast, where we see this kind of massacre scene that when Ozymandias brings in the new help, the new Phillips and Crookshanks, is tons of bodies out there. It doesn't look like a systematic scientific extermination. It looked like it was a party. Like he was going bananas in there. And that kind of suggests that King B was right in his assertion that these heroes, in a way, feed on violence. And it was almost like presciently accurate that we were going to see these acts, and kind of in a Westworld sort of setting, where if there's no one there to judge you and you've got to kill all these people to launch them in a catapult, why not have a party with it?
Yeah, and there were little visual cues there. If you noticed, if you didn't pause it or you weren't looking for it, there was a fourth candle on the cake. Veidt does mention later when he's out in the trebuchet with new Crookshanks, he does say for 4 years. So I think we can say with some level of certainty that the four candles, or the candles, is indicative of the years that we were discussing in previous podcasts. I think we can pretty much say that, right? With 99 the same level of certainty that Will is the grandfather of Angela. Another interesting thing, there was the horseshoe thing again, and he says to Mr. Phillips, I wasn't quite ready for that. One thing that you brought up on the newsstand that I find interesting, I want to float this by you, is if you go on IMDb, Mrs. Crookshanks' character is identified, or the actress who's playing her is identified as Mrs. Crookshanks / Marionette. And you asked King B who it was. Marionette was a kind of a low-level criminal in the world of the Watchmen. On the same IMDb, the actor who is portraying Mr. Phillips does not have a name. And I wonder if they're purposefully hiding that, because in previous shows where there's a mystery, they hide who the character is. Now, in the comic books, I think he was the minstrel, which was he would do crimes with the marionette. So that's one idea. Or is this a Dr. Manhattan hiding in plain sight?
That's what the King Bee thinks, is that this is basically he's modeled after Dr. Manhattan in human form, which would make a lot of sense. What's interesting is in the official Watchmen podcast, Lindelof talked about how they didn't want this to be seen as a sequel. And when they were putting the cast list together and casting and shooting, they just referred to Ozymandias, Adrian Veidt, as English Lord. And he's still in the credits of this episode referred to as Lord, which is kind of fantastic. But one thing that's fantastic about HBO doing this show, you mentioned before, as these bodies go flying into the sky, they kind of blink out of existence. If this was USA or FX, I'd go, yeah, they just didn't have the fucking budget, and that's what the computer animation looked like. No, HBO is doing this on purpose. This doesn't look like somebody drifting into the clouds and out of sight. It's like going, poof. And it just seems to indicate some sort of like a limit to an atmosphere, a hologram, which we see lots of in these episodes.
Yeah, and this would align with Dr. Manhattan's ability to create livable environments on other planets like Mars or in other inhospitable areas. He can control and manipulate elements. He can control all the elements. We see this in the graphic novel when he teleports Laurie up to Mars with him, and then she starts choking, and he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot." So he creates a bubble to where she can live. And then if you recall in episode 1, when we look at the Dr. Manhattan cam, you see Dr. Manhattan on Mars demolishing what looks very similar to the manor that Adrian Veidt is living in. And so I wonder if that time frame that we're seeing where Dr. Manhattan is destroying the castle takes place after Ozymandias and Adrian Veidt has maybe successfully thrown himself off of Mars.
Less sci-fi and more on the emotional side of the show. I wanted to talk a little bit about the issues of trust and also some of the recklessness that we're seeing in the characters. Now, Laurie Blake in this episode is having kind of a, I guess it would be called a heart-to-heart with Angela, except Petey's sitting in the back seat, surprise, just hanging out like a creep.
Again, another brilliant moment of comedic timing, because they're having this back and forth and it's going on for quite a long time. And then you realize that Petey is in the backseat just staying silent, like almost, sit there until I call upon you.
Yeah, he's fantastic. But Laurie Blake says to Angela that people who wear masks, in her belief, generally suffer trauma, and they wear masks to protect themselves from sort of mental and emotional damage, often stemming from their childhood. Now, Angela is saying she wears the mask strictly for protection in the practical sense, right? To hide her identity. But more and more in this episode, we see her becoming less and less attached to her mask. She's basically got it down for like half the episode, where in earlier episodes, she'd be covered up the whole time. She's not even painting most of her face now. It's just kind of a little lace cover over her face. And you see that Laurie Blake knows who she is. And even Senator Keene like IDs her, and she's starting to just come out from behind that mask and become more like them and less like other vigilantes.
One of the problems I had with the show is that you see Sister Night again. There's a montage of her getting dressed in, kind of a superhero kind of way, where you see like the zipping up of the boots, and you see the thing, and they're playing like the music over it. We've talked about how they've done this in other episodes, and I was like, we're at the 4th episode, Lindelof. Like we know how she gets dressed. You don't need to do this again. But if they're doing it because they're trying to show us that she's moving further and further away from the mask, I think it would be a good use of visual storytelling.
I think there was also a little bit of a wink to the audience on that, because she goes through the whole thing and we're like, oh, whose ass is she going to kick now? And she's just going to dump a bag.
Right. And what,
like, that's what she got dressed.
What was in the bag, by the way? Was that all the stuff that she was collecting and dumping from Will Reeves visiting her?
Yeah, I think as soon as she figured out that Laurie Blake was kind of hot on the trail, she wanted to get rid of any evidence of the wheelchair, anything that, the wiping any fingerprints, getting rid of the handcuffs, and even burning up the German propaganda pamphlet. What she didn't count on was the fucking pills being left in the car, which I think speaks to Will not giving a shit about leaving evidence behind. He almost wants to be found out, and he leaves this giant, comically large bottle of pills in the glove compartment, which conspicuously Angela sees and is quick to try to hide. But Laurie, who is smart, I mean, she knows who Angela is. She seems to have things figured out. She doesn't even go after that. She elects not to go, hey, what was that over there? And she just leaves the scene of the dropped car. Again, almost like she's trying to develop some sort of trust. You see almost walls coming down, or again, the alternative explanation is people just stop caring.
I wonder if Will even needs those pills.
Yeah, like maybe they're not even medicine, but some sort of a clue.
Exactly.
And that speaks to what Lady Trieu says to him. She's like, why don't you just fucking tell her, as opposed to, just being these passive aggressive clues.
Yeah. And that's the whole, and that kind of leads into the whole reason that Angela goes to, and of course, Looking Glass would live in this kind of underground nuclear bunker out in the woods, off of the grid. This is exactly the environment that I would imagine Looking Glass living in.
I was surprised by the amount of trust between Sister Night and Looking Glass, where he seems like a very objective character, and she goes to him and basically reveals, the most horrifying of clues. She's like, "These are Judd Crawford's KKK robes, or at least the KKK robes that were found at Judd Crawford's home." And I was surprised that he took them. If you showed up at my house, and you're like, "Hey, take these KKK robes," I'd be like, "I'm a white guy living in Oklahoma during the 7th Cavalry period. No, you can keep those." But another thing that we found out in Looking Glass's sweet ass little bunker is he's got a dark room for one, but he did at one point have a wife. We talked about how this guy seems to be like Rorschach, where he, didn't he doesn't have any sort of personal life or something. He was in a relationship at one point. He refers to his ex, so he seems to be a little more socialized than we anticipated, and a little more sympathetic to Angela's plight.
Yeah, one thing that I found very interesting is how he's exploring the squid, right? Again, if we're talking about like all this genetic modifications and are the squids truly from another dimension or not, we know, again, based upon the comic books and the original graphic novel, that the giant squid was a genetically modified creature to appear as if it was a psychic alien from another dimension that fell upon Manhattan and killed over 3,000 people, that ultimately ended the Cold War and the nuclear arms race and ushered in this utopian idea of peace amongst humankind. Now, it seems as if there's an entire undercurrent, just like we do in human nature. And I think we talked about this a lot on our initial episode, but there was a lot that was cut for good reason. But throughout humanity, whenever there have been huge tragedies, as more and more time moves away from the actual event, there's a lot of people that create theories and conspiracies and try to find reason for it, because it's in our human nature to try and explain the reason why something happened. And it seems as if that is also what is one of Looking Glass's favorite hobbies. Maybe it's almost to a point of obsession, because there is a dark room, where he's, again, there's no digital cameras, I guess, at this time. So he's having these all developed in his underground bunker. And I wonder if this obsession with the squid and these conspiracies led to the demise of his marriage, right? That happens a lot of times with individuals like that. And then again, not to spoil it, but for those who've seen the coming attractions, I think in the next episode, we're going to see a little bit more about Looking Glass. And he's also attached to this religion, it seems like, that believes that there's other dimensions. One of the things that you'll notice and why that relates and why I'm bringing it up is when Cal is explaining the idea of heaven to their adopted children, he doesn't really talk about God. He says he's returned to nothingness. He wasn't there before, then he was. It almost seems that he's taking more of an atheist point of view. Looking Glass seems as if he's the kind of character that would get obsessed with this and almost get obsessed with religion, which is almost a dichotomy when his vigilante character is all about truth and facts and finding the real purpose. It seems that in his personal life, though, it's so different than his professional life, where he's believing that there's other dimensions and these squids are coming down, when in reality, these squids could just be a way of government manipulation and keeping society under its foot.
Yeah, and we've seen that before in Lindelof's series. There's always that question of faith, of belief. It was in Lost, definitely in The Leftovers. And in The Leftovers and Lost both, you had people who went from skeptic to almost evangelical. And you had things go the other way around too, people losing faith. So I think that will be something that we see. I'm very excited for the next episode, strictly because it seems to be focused around Looking Glass.
Again, you talked about the trust that Angela has in Looking Glass. Again, a white man who lives in Oklahoma in this underground bunker where he's researching squid. She seems very cavalier in handing over the KKK robes and saying, "Can you keep this here?" He asked the question, "Do you think Judd was cavalry?" And she's like, "Well, what do you think? I mean, if Judd is hiding this in his closet, what could it be?" And Looking Glass's initial reaction to this was more of, "Let's look at the clues. Let's look at the facts." And he looks and he says, "Well, this is, old school. We know that." And he brings up that Judd's granddaddy was a lawman. And again, I was very tinfoily in the beginning, much to the dismay of King B in analyzing the closet and trying to make that connection and saying, well, I'm pretty sure the young guy that we see could be Judd's grandfather. And it looks like there's some evidence that may be pointing towards that. But I liked how, hopefully they're not going to make Judd out to be this too big bad guy, because I do believe that was convenient for a show like this. And I think we're gonna, and I think there's some more story that's left there, and so I'm really looking forward to that.
Speaking of bad guys and good guys, obviously Lindelof never goes that simple in any series that he does, but there does seem to be this connection, maybe I don't know if it's a secret society, a gang of villains, whatever, between Will Reeves and Lady Trieu. I'm not quite sure what they're up to, but it seems to be something Angela's really not going to like. Yeah,
you see Bian waking up. She has that nightmare. We talked about how those could be memories of a former family member who went through that Melee massacre. The reaction of Lady Trieu, I think, kind of pointed towards that this is not really truly her child. It's not really a motherly reaction. Instead of saying, okay, baby, let me walk you back to bed and put you back to sleep, she says, good. And she says, no, I'm not going to do that. And then Bian turns and looks at an off camera member who we didn't even know was there. And it turns out to be Will Reeves. So Will Reeves is in the watchtower clock with Lady Trieu. It would seem to indicate that the vehicle that lifted Will Reeves in Angela's car is one of those drones. There was also some reveals here. Not only is Will Reeves seem to be working with Lady Trieu, they seem to have some sort of deal, some sort of arrangement, because Lady Trieu is worried that family is going to muddy the waters, emotions are going to get in the way, and that whatever deal they have planned out, he's going to back out because there is that family connection. He responds by saying, well, in 3 days, she'll know what I've done and she'll hate me for it. During this time, he's also getting up and showing the audience that he can walk. So all the questions of how he escaped and how he was able to string up Judd now kind of all makes sense. And that was my initial reaction. I'm sorry I didn't even say it in the beginning when we launched podcast, but it seemed a little too convenient that Will Reeves was in this wheelchair. And
I do think it's interesting that Lady Trieu had a talk in Vietnamese with Angela and asked flat out, your grandfather wants to know if you got the pills. And Angela is quite defiant in her response back in Vietnamese. And so there is no love lost between these characters. But I do love Angela being just a normal person, just a cop who is not afraid of any of these people. She's not afraid of Laurie Blake. She's not afraid of Lady Trieu. She's not afraid of Will. She is not afraid of the 7th Cavalry. And we did get some other clues as to Will's origins in this episode, too, as we tried to place where his history is between 1921 and present day.
Yeah, and this gets into kind of the odds and ends. It does seem as if Will obviously was confirmed as Little Boy based upon the certainty of the acorn and the ancestry. Will Reeves was a New York cop that retired early. This could be indications that he's Hooded Justice. And as I was writing the notes, we talked about the behind baseball. I was labeling everything Hooded Justice, and then you put in there, whoa, slow your roll.
Yeah, not quite sure he's Hooded Justice yet, but we have Hooded Justice fighting crime in New York City in the 40s. Right. We have Will Reeves as a cop in the 40s. Hooded Justice never unmasked, always hiding his identity, which would be a good idea if you were a black vigilante in New York City right. in the 40s. And then in addition to all of that, Hooded Justice retires and Will Reeves retires early from being a cop. Might be something there.
Yeah, exactly. Also, we know that the original Night Owl was also a beat cop as well. So things might make sense there. Are we calling the silver bullets? What are we calling him? What like kind of it looked like an alien there, but then he was dousing himself in oil. What's going on there?
I don't know what it was. Sexy, whatever it was. But but I was so glad that the show labeled him Lube Man, because I wrote down in my notes Greasy Boy, and I would have spent and I would have spent the next 5 weeks telling everybody on the podcast about how much I love Greasy Boy. But what kind of a shitty power is that? You can slide into the sewer.
Yeah,
he runs fast too, I guess.
He looked like, again, bringing it back to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, he looked like the Foot, like a Silver Foot Clan member. Another odds and ends. We talked about the eggs. I thought the whisking of the eggs by Cal and Angela as they're about to sit down and have a family breakfast. Did you kind of get like the mixing of the eggs is kind of like their family?
Yeah, I did, and I was really worried that we were going to get like a drop of blood in there, kind of like we did in earlier episodes too. That was really disturbing earlier on, so I'm really glad we got to skip that this time.
A couple odds and ends. Have you been on Peteypedia yet?
I have not in the last week.
Okay, so for this week, there's two things on Peteypedia. There's a transcript of Laurie shortly after she was caught, where she's being interviewed by the anti-vigilante squad. So this is back in like 1995. Apparently, Laurie at this time was going around being the comedian. So it appears as they had her and Dan had a falling out. This was a one last job that they were going to do together. They were going to stop a terrorist attack. We also learned that Dan has been Dan and Laurie during their vigilante spree. The way that they got their resources is Dan was working and selling his technology back to law enforcement through Merlin Corp. So he was actually making owl ships for law enforcement. So what we saw in episode 1 when Judd is flying, that's not actual the Archimedes. That's just something that another owl ship that he was selling back to law enforcement. And that's how he was making his money.
And again, if you're sitting at home right now wondering who the fuck Dan is, we're talking about Dan Dreiberg, who is the Night Owl 2 the Watchmen graphic novel, presumably in prison right now.
Yeah, he's in prison, according to Peteypedia, because he would not give up. He said he was going to continue to do it. And then also in Peteypedia, there's blueprints. So this is the most passive aggressive. So even more passive aggressive than Will Reeves leaving the pill bottle behind. Apparently, we talked at great lengths and it was kind of a subject for a lot of Twitter content was the blue dildo that was left behind. Well, the blueprints for that blue dildo are up on Peteypedia, and in the transcripts, Laurie tells the history of that. And what it was is because of their bad breakup, Dan created this and gave it to her as kind of a fuck you. You always will long for him. There's nothing I could ever do. I could never amount to him. So, go fuck yourself with the big giant Dr. Manhattan blue dildo. That's some passive aggressive shit.
It also explains the horrible design. A man had to have designed that. A woman would have never designed a dildo that poorly shaped.
Not at all. But again, really, really clever stuff that they're doing. I find this more entertaining than I do with the Westworld stuff that they were doing, kind of in a similar vein. If we had to draw comparisons, I like what they're doing here with Watchmen. One last thing, the Millennium Tower. We talked a little bit about this in episode 3 deep dive. We get a little bit more background on that. The fact that it's first wonder of the New World. It's impervious. It's inland, so it's resistant to flood. And short of a nuclear blast or something similar, it cannot be destroyed. Now, one could mean that that's foreshadowing, Gene, that Dr. Manhattan is the only one who can destroy this clock. And so I wonder if there's going to be some sort of recruitment of Dr. Manhattan and going against Lady Trieu, or if Lady Trieu is trying to call out Dr. Manhattan as part of the atrocities that he did back in Vietnam. And I wonder if there's some sort of power that's going on there. So I don't know. We'll see, but it's interesting because it tells time.
It's funny that everyone initially reacted to this episode with, oh, it was just answering a bunch of questions and nothing really happened. And we end the episode after a second watch going, what the fuck is going on?
That's right.
So more mysteries abound. But again, we have 5 exciting episodes left. That concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Watchmen. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. Thanks everybody who's been so active on Twitter. I know Raj and I have really enjoyed getting the feedback back and forth. Great ideas bouncing around from Coach Marcus, from Ash Schlafly, and others. People prodding us to get started on Westworld already. Raj and I are on the road right now. Big D is in Brazil. We're recording movies episodes like at 10 a.m. And trying to get everything out on time. So another show right now would literally break us. But thanks so much for interacting with us, and we're doing our best. The website is shatontv.com. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The email, again, if you'd like to get in touch with us for the newsstand edition, is hosts@shatontv.com. And wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube, be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please be sure to leave a review. That helps the podcast grow. I think we're up to about 170 reviews.
They're coming in hot and heavy. I mean, no other Watchmen podcast on iTunes has as many reviews as we do. I mean, unofficial podcasts as we do. So thanks everyone who's been doing that, and everyone's been really positive, 5 stars. And check out the newsstand. I really enjoyed. I was traveling, and I listened to you and King B on the newsstand. Not only were the emails just top notch, but the interaction and the banter and King B's collective knowledge of the history of the comic books is so dense. We just got to get him a little bit more positive on some of these tinfoil theories. but no, really good stuff. Check that out.
Yeah, we got to give him whatever's in Will's pill bottle. Maybe get him going a little bit. On behalf of my co-host Roger Roper and the King Bee, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us later in the week for the episode 4 Watchmen Newsstand. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.